We now have the final lecture before our final symposium of the conference. And it's my great pleasure to introduce Grace Lindsay from NYU, who will talk about developing neural systems understanding. Please join me in welcoming Grace.
Hello. Okay, thanks. Yeah, so I want to start off by kind of very clearly situating the work that I'm going to talk about, because I think it differs from what we've been seeing so far in that it's more maybe philosophy of science than philosophy of mind, or maybe it's not philosophy at all, depending on how strict you are. I am myself not a philosopher by training. I'm a neuroscientist. And so I want to start off by thinking about the field of neuroscience, which has been around for like 100, 200 years, depending on how you define it. And it's been trying to understand brains and peripheral nervous systems and trying to understand how those nervous systems create behavior. A more recent field is interpretable AI, rapidly developing, but definitely not as old as neuroscience and not as big as neuroscience. But there is some interaction between these two fields already, right? So we've already seen some examples of some analysis of artificial neural networks that had a flavor of maybe things that have been done in neuroscience. And there's certainly been the goal of trying to compare these systems and saying if they function the same way or what are their properties and that sort of thing. And there's also the big specter of psychology and cognitive science, which we've definitely seen a lot of, which interacts with all of these fields and their intersection. But I'm going to focus more on neuroscience in particular, and the interaction between neuroscience and interpretable AI. And basically the claim that I'm making is that these two fields should come even closer together, and they should explicitly develop a unified field of neural systems understanding. And so what that would be is a field of study that develops a common set of tools, concepts, and frameworks that can guide the analysis of data from both real and artificial systems. And so in this talk, I'm going to kind of give motivation for this, give support that this would be a good idea for everybody involved, and talk a little bit about how to actually implement it. And also talk about some of the kinds of questions and assumptions that making this kind of claim entails. Okay, so I wanted to start by actually walking through kind of what people in neuroscience do. What are the analysis methods that neuroscientists use? How do they study neural systems? And so I chose this paper from 2014, the neural dynamics of reaching following incorrect or absent motor preparation, because I think it's not anything super specific about this paper. I just think it's representative of a set of analysis methods and a set of a style of interpretation that is common in many areas of neuroscience, especially recently. So the goal of this study was to see how the activity in motor cortex changes in different conditions of reaching. So it's there's a macaque who is trained to reach in different directions with their arm. And the kind of trial structure here is that they hold their arm in the center of the field, and then they are given a target location. So the target comes on, and that tells them where they will need to move their hand. They're not supposed to move it yet. There's a delay, and then they're given a go cue that tells them to actually go ahead and execute that movement. And so that's kind of the basic trial. This second line on the bottom here is an alternative version of this trial, which is that instead of being given the go cue after a delay, they could actually be told, no, wait, don't go to that location, go to a different location. So the target switches. And then there can be another delay and then the go cue. So in that case, they would have prepared for one movement, and then they would have need to make a different movement instead. And in both of these delay periods, you can vary them so that there's essentially no delay. So the go cue and the target come on at the same time, or there can be very long delays up to a second in between when the monkey is told where it will need to move and when it's actually supposed to make that movement. So that's the structure of this experiment. And they were the authors of this study recorded from neurons and motor cortex during this experiment. And so when you do that, you get these kinds of data, which is the response of individual neurons over the course of these trials. And so you can see they're aligning the neural activity according to these landmarks in the trial of the target is on, then the go cue is on, then the movement actually happens. And they're representing what the neuron is doing in terms of firing rate, which is very common, the number of spikes that a neuron emits per second. And neuroscientists have spent decades trying to understand plots like these, basically looking at these plots of individual neural activity in response to different stimuli or as the animal produces different behavior. And there have been works that try to classify, we have neurons that do this kind of thing, we have neurons that do that kind of thing, and just generally trying to make sense of what the neurons are doing to try to understand how the brain processes inputs or produces outputs. Somewhat recently, the field of neuroscience has kind of realized that, hey, this is pretty hard to do, to look at a bunch of individual units and their activity over time and actually try to say something useful and interesting about them. And so there has been a switch, especially accompanied by increases in the technology available for recording neurons, where now, you can be recording thousands of neurons, which makes an individual neuron approach even less feasible. So there's been a big shift to using dimensionality reduction for looking at neural activity. And so in most cases, in this case, you just perform principal components analysis on your neural activity of the entire population. And so instead of having to think about neural activity in, whatever 100 or 200 neuron space that you have, you can reduce it down and plot plots like these, where you can look at the activity of the entire population in about 3 dimensions. And so in this particular study, again, what we're thinking about here is how the motor cortex prepares and executes movements. And so you can see that there's a baseline. Sorry, I don't know how to get my cursor to be on this screen. Ah, there we go. So you can see that there is a baseline location in the neural activity space that the neural activity starts at the beginning of a trial. And we're going to first look at the gray line, which is a normal trial where the monkey does not have to switch the location that it's going to. And so in that case, after the monkey is given the information about where it will need to move after the target goes on, the neural activity moves to this location in space. And this is called by people in the motor cortex literature a preparatory state, because that neural activity is specific to that movement direction. So if the monkey was told it needs to move right, it would go to the preparatory state associated with that. And you can see that there's kind of squiggles there, meaning that it hangs out there for a while over time, waiting for the go cue to come on. So it goes to that location, it hangs out for a while, and then the go cue comes on, and then you see this pattern of dynamics that the population executes that's associated with actually making that movement. And you can see when the actual movement is occurring by the motion of the arm. And so that's what happens in the normal trial. And then what happens in a switch trial is that, let's say in this case, the monkey was told it will need to move its arm to the left. So it goes to the preparatory state associated with left. Then instead of a go cue, it gets another target that says, oh, no, wait, you actually have to move to the right. So it goes to the preparatory state associated with the right. And then a go cue comes on and it again executes that same movement. So that's how you read these kinds of plots. And what this study was, the main kind of finding from this paper was that actually you don't need to go to the preparatory state to make that movement. And that was something that kind of previously had been put forth as, you need to go to this preparatory state. It encodes the movement direction. It's the initial conditions of a dynamical system. You need to go there and then you execute the movement. And by analyzing trials where there was no delay between the second target presentation and the go cue, they can see that you don't actually need to go to that preparatory state. So in this case, for the switch trial, the monkey was told a first movement, it was hanging out there. It was then told a second movement direction, but at the very same time, it was given the go cue. So it said, actually go to this other place instead and do it right now. And the neural activity completely skips the preparatory state associated with that second movement. So that was the finding. That was one of the main findings from this paper. And I'm interested in the types of analyses that people do. So this kind of dimensionality reduction and visualization, and then also the claims that people make from it. And so in this paper, there's a whole section about how this offers an updated model of motor cortical dynamics. And they even put like a couple little kind of cartoon, diagrams explaining the type of model that they're thinking about. And they say it's an enhancement and expansion of previous models. And here model is kind of word model. It's not a mathematical model. They're just saying this is how we've been thinking about motor cortex. And now we need to update our thinking about motor cortex as a result of these results. And so specifically, they talk about how we need to think about motor cortex as two different dynamical systems, one that does preparatory work and one that does movement generation, and you can kind of have movement generation even without the preparatory system. So that's a kind of a takeaway of the paper. Is like, we did this data analysis, we had this high dimensional data set, and now we've compressed it into this nice little story to update about how motor cortex works. Another important example from this paper is that in their analysis of what happens when you put the target and the go cue on at the same time, they found out that if you look at the neural activity in motor cortex, you can actually see information about the target in the neural activity before you get a sign that the go cue has arrived and that the movement should happen. So even though as the experimenter, they gave this information to the monkey at the exact same time, they can see in motor cortex that it doesn't show up at the same time there. And so that was kind of a mystery to them. And they posit that, well, maybe whatever system is sending the go cue information to the motor cortex, maybe it's monitoring, it's looking at what the activity is in motor cortex, and it waits for just the right time to tell motor cortex to go. That's something that they offer as a possibility, because in their data set, they can't actually resolve this issue, because they know that they gave it to the monkey at the same time and the neural activity is saying it's not showing up at the same time. And so they have to come up with some possible explanation for this difference. Okay, so that, as I said, this I think represents a lot of things that happen in neuroscience papers. You have high dimensional dynamic data. You need to somehow grapple with it with something like dimensionality reduction. There's a lot of looking at the results and coming up with stories and updating previous stories based on those kinds of things. And then there is also plenty of times where there's something about your data that you can't explain, and you have to appeal to some unknown factor that isn't part of the experiment that you actually carried out. And so I want to know, are these tools of systems neuroscience helping us understand the brain? Was that, example successful in helping us understand the brain? And could these same tools help us understand artificial neural networks? So that's kind of the basis of what I'm interested in and why I'm advocating for some kind of united attempt to address these questions. So importantly, if I'm asking if these can help us understand, we probably need to give understanding some sort of definition or speak to what that would look like or what we mean by that. And I'm sure, there's plenty of background in philosophy about what that could mean and explanation and science and all of that. Again, I'm coming from the neuroscience perspective, which means that we're going to talk about Mars levels. And so neuroscientists, like to think about where their problem is situated in a MAR hierarchy, where the first level is the computational level, meaning the goal of the system. So what is that brain area trying to do? Motor cortex is trying to produce reaches. The algorithm is what steps need to be taken to execute that. And then the implementation is physically, what neurons, what parts of the brain are responsible for that. And so I actually like this diagram of it because this is labeling flight as the goal of, I guess not the whole bird, but part of the bird. Its goal is to fly. They're saying the algorithm is flapping of the wings and the implementation is feathers. And I actually disagree with the way that this is broken down, which I think is incredibly indicative of the kind of squishy nature of Mars levels. So I would probably say that the algorithmic level is something like, the control of the dynamics of the airflow and all of that. And then the implementation is wings and feathers. But if you define the algorithmic level in that more abstract way, then you can do things like say, well, airplanes use the same algorithm. They don't need to flap their wings to do it, but it's the same principle that's causing flight as birds. And so that's one of the benefits of kind of separating the algorithm from the implementation level, is that then you can compare across systems that have different physical implementations. But yeah, I would say that much of at least systems neuroscience is aiming for an algorithmic understanding, right? And I want to, be clear, sometimes the word algorithm means a super precise set of steps. And that's not really how it's used in this case. It's more of a simplified story that should offer some predictive ability. It needs to give you something, but it's going to be lossy. It is not the exact set of steps and the exact, weights or anything like that. But I would argue it should be a productive and accurate model, meaning you should be able to do something with it. If you have that model, that simplified story, you should be able to do something with it. And really these things are tied together, productive and accurate, because if it's an inaccurate model, you're not going to be able to do much with it. But I think that is important to keep in mind, and that's going to drive how I'm operationalizing understanding. And so the specific way that I'm doing that is what I'm calling experimentally validated understanding. It has a lot of overlap with what we've seen in terms of representations and how to prove that something is a true representation. And so basically the idea is that you have some complex neural system and you want to understand how it works in some way, presumably on some sort of algorithmic level. So you apply some sort of analysis to that neural system, and that gives you this kind of simplified understanding. You start with this big, messy, high-dimensional thing, and then you can pull out of it like, okay, I think this is the series of steps that are happening. Roughly, that's what's going on. And a lot of neuroscience papers stop there. In like the example that we just saw, you apply the analysis to the neural system, you get this simplified story, and you say, great, I made progress. But to actually show that this analysis gave you an accurate and productive model of your system, you need to follow up with some experiments that show that you can predict and control the neural network as on the basis of the simplified understanding that you have on it. So what I'm arguing is that basically to prove that an analysis method has provided the kind of understanding that we should be seeking is that you need to be able to devise an experiment based on the understanding that you got from that analysis method, and that experiment should be able to, the outcome of that should verify your understanding. And specifically, I'm interested in a type of understanding that allows you to control the behavior of the system. So for example, modulating the activity in motor cortex and actually controlling the reach dynamics, not just modulating activity in motor cortex and nothing changes in the output. Because I think the goal is to understand how these neural dynamics are related to behavior. And so the test of if we have that understanding should be, can we control behavior? But that raises a reasonable question of, does control demonstrate understanding? I know there's a lot of debate about that, and if you can train a giant neural network to control a system, does that mean that you understand the system? Most people would say no, but I have reasons to argue that this particular type of control that I'm advocating for does demonstrate understanding. So to start, I mean, just to argue for this, I guess, is to just say that control is desired. Even if it's not understanding, it is desired. So especially in interpretable AI, especially if you're talking about applications in industry, the whole point is we need to understand these systems so that we can make sure that they're safe and they're reliable and all of these things. And so you want to be able to control the system. That is key to interpretable AI. And also, I would say neuroscience is pretty focused on understanding how neurons produce intelligent behavior. And so that connection is what you want to get at. And you have to be able to demonstrate that connection by controlling behavior, by modulating the neural system. And also it's especially important for something like neuroengineering, which is sometimes explicitly about controlling behavior based on neuroscience principles. I would also say that this is desire, a good definition of understanding because it does connect the algorithmic level to the computational. Again, the computational level is defining the goal of the system, what it's trying to do, and the algorithm is supposed to implement the steps to achieve that goal. So you should be able to fiddle with those steps and change what happens with the behavior of the system that's trying to achieve that goal. And then specifically this definition that I'm arguing for, I think it has a leg up on just kind of like, if you trained a big neural network to control a system, would that be understanding? You have a leg up here because you have this step where you have to kind of have a human in the loop that's coming up with a simplified story and coming up with an experiment. So there's a compression bottleneck there that it has to pass through a human in some way. Now, this could still be like we saw, somewhat complex nonlinear decoders that humans apply, and then they modulate the neural activity based on that. But there's still some way in which a human is coming in and saying, these are the features that seem important. And this is how I think the network needs to be modified. Okay, so in practice, experimentally validated understanding is very difficult in neuroscience. In the motor cortex example, they're claiming that this, location in the population activity space means something about the preparation of the movement in certain circumstances and all of that. And to verify that, you would need to be able to modulate kind of the full population of neural activity in motor cortex in very specific ways on a pretty fast time scale, because there's also the dynamics involved. And just generally, it's not feasible to perform really precise, well-controlled experiments in neuroscience because of the technical limitations in modulating the brain. So that means that it's not practical to evaluate our tools using brains. We're not going to be able to know if our tools are giving this kind of valid understanding by just relying on kind of observational-ish studies of the brain that don't have that next step of validating the simple model that you got. And so I think that we should do a very large-scale test of tools of neuroscience on artificial neural networks, okay? So basically the plan would be you pick a method from neuroscience, you get a bunch of different artificial neural networks, different architectures, trained on different tasks, trained in different ways, apply that method to those networks. You'll get some sort of simplified understanding from the application of those methods possibly, and then you close the loop by following up with an experiment that should allow you to control the artificial neural network, right? And then if you do this across many different types of networks, you can get a broad understanding of if this tool reliably provides what we want out of these tools, essentially. So it's like a meta science question. It's not really about the systems themselves, it's about the tools. I'm asking a question of, is this tool useful? And this is how I want to answer that question, by testing it on a bunch of different artificial neural networks. And the reasons that artificial neural networks are great for this, as I kind of alluded to, in opposition to the brain, they are fully perturbable, which is great. You can do almost any experiment you want. You can change neural activity, you can change connections, you can change things about how the network was trained or what data it gets to see. You can do any kind of experiment of showing it things it wasn't trained on, all of these kinds of things. It's a dream as a neuroscientist. It's an ideal environment for doing neuroscience experiments, because you have none of the technical limitations that you do on actual animals. And so that is really important for getting this, verification that the understanding that you have is correct. And then also they're fully observable. So that influences the analysis that you would apply, because as I said, in like the motor cortex example, I think that paper has like 200 neurons. There's a lot more neurons than that in motor cortex, and there's a lot more neurons than that in the brain. And so as that paper showed, they had something they couldn't understand, and they had to appeal to this unseen third factor. You don't get that out in artificial neural networks. If you can't understand what's happening, it's because you missed it. You have all the data, it's there, it's in the network. If you can't get it, that's on you, and that's on the analysis method. It's not due to any limitations of the data. And I think that's really important too, that you don't have those free parameters to say, oh, this is why I can't explain what's happening. Everything you need is in that model, and you can get it. And then the other element of artificial neural networks that I think makes them a good test, in opposition to something like simulated data. Sometimes when people build a method, they simulate some data where they know the kind of correct answer that their method is supposed to recover, and then they apply their method and they say, hey, look, it recovered the correct answer, and that's great. That means my method works. That has, its uses, but I think the fact that we don't understand artificial neural networks on the algorithmic level that well is actually great for testing the tools we want to apply to the brain, which we also don't understand. Because if you already know the answer, it's hard to say for certain that this method got you there. You can be a little kind of tainted by already knowing the answer, and also just even knowing the shape of the answer is going to influence your search. When you don't know the answer at all, you have to define what success looks like. And I think that's really important, and something that neuroscientists don't speak super explicitly about, of what are you actually trying to get out of this, and is it succeeding? So I think that that ignorance is actually good in artificial neural networks. So to make it a little bit more concrete, this is just a list of some of the methods that could be tested from neuroscience on artificial neural networks. We've seen some of them, again, like dimensionality reduction, latent factor modeling, lots of different things related to representations, representational similarity, representational geometry. There's also like network neuroscience, which is more about connections. And I don't know that we've been thinking about that so much, but more about activity. And yeah, there's also a whole zoo of very specific models that were, specific methods that were developed for like a single paper that wanted to apply them. And so there's really just a lot out there that you can pull from and see if it helps you understand artificial neural networks. Okay, so to summarize this part, I'm claiming we should take the tools from neuroscience and test them on artificial neural networks. Now, technically, that answers the second question, not the first, right? That would tell us that these tools help us understand artificial neural networks. Does that tell us that they help us understand the brain? And this is where things get a little bit more subjective, maybe a little bit fuzzier. And so really the question is, what has to be true about two systems in order to be able to successfully apply an analysis method to both? And this is something that I don't think is spoken of explicitly very much. What is this relationship here? I don't think that we really have a word for anything like this. It's kind of like how in some cultures there's a word for the parents of two people who are married, like they get their own special relationship. In English, we don't have that word. We don't have anything that really tells us what is true about these two systems if it's the case that a given analysis method works on both of them. And you can say like, this is maybe a bit of a bland problem to have, like does this question matter, or is it meaty in any way? And I think when I frame it like this, it doesn't seem maybe that interesting. But to adapt a quote that Rosa used yesterday, if it were hurricanes and pandemics, people would be fine, but you replace it with artificial neural networks in the brains and everyone loses their mind. Because at least coming from the neuroscience perspective, people who are fully neuroscientists, if you ask them this question of what is the relationship between artificial neural networks in the brain, they have a lot of thoughts. Some people are really gung-ho about that. Some people are like, get this out of my field. This isn't helping anything. And so this question, this particular question has a lot of weight on it that can influence, in my experience, people's willingness to accept that this program of testing the tools could actually be helpful. So what does need to be true of these two systems in order to claim that, that we can apply the same tools to them? So obviously, they both need to conform to the formal requirements of the method. So if you're using some statistical tool that says this tool is only well behaved if your data is normally distributed, then fine. They both need to follow those formal requirements. But I would say that the formal requirements of a method are a very small minority of the kind of unspoken things that people assume need to be true about a system to apply an analysis method, and that by doing this exploration of testing these tools, we might actually make some of these implicit beliefs more explicit, kind of argue why do they think a method can work on the brain and not on artificial neural networks, or in the opposite direction. So I think, yeah, there's the answer to this question, what needs to be true? There's the very simple answer of simply you need to follow the rules of the method, and if it strictly meets all the requirements, then you're fine. And that's the only thing that these two kinds of systems have in common. But I think there is a lot more going on there that we're not talking about. And to prove that, I would point to the fact that neuroscientists will apply the same method to vastly different species and be totally fine with it. So things like dimensionality reduction, these kinds of somewhat hypothesis neutral methods in particular, you can see them applied to C. elegans, to mice, to monkeys, to humans, and there isn't a sense of like, oh, those systems work differently, so we can't apply the same method to them. So it doesn't need to be the case that artificial neural networks work like the brain in order to apply the same analysis method to both of them. But when you bring up the relationship between artificial neural networks and the brain, people immediately go to, well, do they work the same? Are they the same? Is an artificial neural network a good model of the brain? And I want to point out that that's not what has to happen here. So if a mouse is a good model of the human brain, we can ask that question too, but we usually don't ask that question when we see the same analysis method applied to both. And people also sometimes say, oh, they don't need to be implemented the same way, but they need to function the same way. They need to be performing the same algorithms, essentially. So sometimes people point to the fact that, some people are okay with convolutional neural networks as models of the visual system, even though they're not, physical neurons and all that. But they are not okay with them as models because convolutional neural networks have a texture bias instead of a shape bias. But the way that you know that a convolutional neural network has a texture bias instead of a shape bias is by applying the same analysis methods that you did to the brain. So even if they're implementing different algorithms, the whole point of the analysis methods is to recover those algorithms. And so it shouldn't be a problem that they're implementing different algorithms. Okay, so we have this kind of pool of things that can all be subjected to the same analysis. And I think it's a little vague as to what needs to be true about all these systems to claim that they can all be subjected to the same analysis. But I'm going to point to some features of both artificial neural networks in the brain that I think are relevant. So both high dimensional, have hierarchy recurrence in them. They're nonlinear. They can be distributed or modular or somewhere in between. They are both task optimized using different processes, but they both are trying to achieve some sort of goal or behavior. And they're both information processing systems. And I think all of these features make them hard to study. I think that's why we struggle, is because there's this network is achieving some kind of goal, but it's doing it in this weird, complicated, distributed way. But I think that these features, because they're in common, we should certainly expect to be able to find analysis methods that can be applied to both systems. Okay, so to actually execute this development of this field, as I said, we need to validate methods from neuroscience, but we should also be validating methods from interpretable AI. So some methods from interpretable AI are directly kind of aligned with this experimentally validated approach in that they try to control the behavior of the network, but not all methods from interpretable AI do. So even those methods would need to be validated by the same procedure. And then to truly make the field kind of unified and productive across these boundaries, we would probably need to kind of retrofit some of the interpretable AI methods so that they could be applied to neural data, which has way more constraints and difficulties associated with it. So that would be another step. And then hopefully you could identify the ways in which these current methods fail or don't work so well and use that to build better methods. And then and as a kind of overarching goal, if you do this for long enough, this kind of joint procedure, you should be able to identify some themes and concepts and a vocabulary for describing these systems that I think that we're missing at this point. Okay, so just to be super clear, what does this not mean? To do this kind of work, it doesn't require any specific claims about artificial neural networks as models of the brain. Separately, I love artificial neural networks as models of the brain, but you don't have to agree with me on that at all for this. It does not assume that all neural systems should be submitted to the same tools. It's about identifying which tools are good in which circumstances. Maybe the architecture of the network, influences the types of tools you need to understand it. That's fine. And it doesn't mean that all questions in neuroscience and AI will be answered by these tools. There are people in neuroscience who want to know about ion flows in individual neurons and all of that kind of thing. And that's not really the level that we're targeting here. But I assume there are enough questions in both of these fields that people do want answered that it's worth it to have them come together and try to do this. Okay, and so, as I showed in the beginning, these fields are already a little overlapping. There's a little bit of the methods from, neuroscience and AI. I would argue that neuroscience is paying less attention to interpretable AI, but there's a little bit of interaction. So why do we really need to go through the effort of making this a unified field where people could say, I study neural systems, and there'd be conferences where people are studying the brain and artificial neural networks? Is there a reason to more explicitly unite these fields? So I would say that there's a benefit from crossing disciplinary boundaries. I wrote a book essentially about the history of computational neuroscience that's filled with examples of what can happen if people with a totally different background put their eyes on an old problem in a different field. You get really new ideas coming out. So I think that's definitely a reason to encourage more explicit interaction. And also it just widens the zoo of neural systems that you can study and hopefully identify kind of common patterns and abstractions in, or provide certain proofs of concept, that kind of thing. I know, there are things that people assume about the brain that artificial neural networks have shown don't have to be true about a neural information processing system. And then, specifically, how will the two sides each benefit? So neuroscience will benefit from the rapid prototyping. As I talked about, you can do all of these experiments super quickly, super completely, and you can do that in artificial neural networks. AI, I think, will benefit from the fact that the types of systems that exist in biology are still pretty different from what exists in AI. So we've talked a lot about language models. We haven't talked much at all about bodies and the fact that people exist in a body, or organisms exist in a physical world and need to control bodies, and what constraints does that put on a system, and how does that help you understand it? And also the fact that biological systems are evolved. Sometimes the way that the networks are trained is considered perhaps a liability, or influences how you understand them. So just giving us that broader set of neural systems to study could be beneficial for both sides. But honestly, it's neuroscience that would benefit the most, I think. And so I feel some kinship with Rob, because the field that I come from, in my opinion, is not delivering. As I said, neuroscience has been around for over 100 years. I really thought that when people developed artificial neural systems, they could come to us and be like, we got to figure out how these work. And as neuroscientists, we'd be like, okay, you want to know that about your neural system? Here's the tool that you should use. And we'd have a nice little recipe book for how you understand your neural system. And we don't. we're not really hitting that goal, despite all the time that we've had with it. So from my perspective, neuroscience stands to benefit a lot from getting more people and more techniques involved in trying to understand neural systems. Especially, the artificial neural networks, you have the benefit of being able to do like truly impossible things in the brain. You can take gradients and all of that kind of stuff. There's not any analog to that in the brain. And so interpretable AI, they have a wider tool set available to them. I've already been impressed by what people are doing there. They're really like off and running. And so, yeah, I want to believe that neuroscientists should be able to help there. But if I'm being totally honest, I think neuroscience is going to benefit more from this relationship. Okay, so I've been claiming, that this synergy and this effort should kind of lead us to new ways of thinking about neural systems, which implies, that what we have is inefficient or insufficient. And I think that's definitely true. It's what I hear from neuroscientists, is that they feel like they don't have the right vocabulary to talk about high dimensional neural systems and how to study them. And so I think we need to ask, what would a successful language for neural systems look like? So I think, there's a lot of trends in looking at what understanding means that talk about compression. And, you need to be able to explain this new thing in terms of already existing concepts and familiar ideas. And so that makes sense. But I think it's important to remember that what's familiar can change. If you think about the history of education in mathematics, like concepts that used to only be comprehensible to the most advanced people in universities are now taught in high school, and we can all use them as the basis for even more complex things. Just look at also the diagrams of artificial neural networks in machine learning papers. You just have like a little block that says transformer, and we're all like, okay, but like that itself is like a crazy complex thing. And yet we're able to build understanding by abstracting away things that weren't familiar but become familiar. So I think we will need new kind of units to discuss the algorithms of neural systems in. And I don't think that we have a good vocabulary for that at this time. And I think that that's holding things back a lot. We also have to note that some people would argue that this isn't possible, that achieving this algorithmic level of kind of looking at the representations and activity in a neural network, you're not going to be able to say anything productive about that. And particularly, the argument is that the way you understand a neural network is that its architecture, its objective function, and its training algorithm, and the data that it was trained on. And like, that's how you understand it, and you don't try to do anything more than that. I hopefully, as in an optimistic way, disagree with that. I am a co-author on that second paper, but I don't necessarily think that the goal is completely out of reach. As I just said on the previous slide, I think it requires a reframing, and this idea that you're going to understand what a neural system is doing in terms of like concepts that we all learned about as like 5-year-olds, like an edge and a square and stuff like that. I don't think that that's going to hold, but I think we can still develop concepts that can form the basis of an algorithmic understanding in neuroscience. Because really what this claim is saying is that there's simply no way to compress a neural network. It simply is what it is, and there's nothing that you can say about it that isn't just describing the entire system. And that doesn't seem right kind of theoretically, but it also doesn't seem right empirically, because we have, algorithms that try to take a trained neural network and make them smaller so they can run more efficiently. So there's compression that's done there, or trying to extract the rules that generated weights, even if you don't have to train the whole neural network. There are efforts in machine learning to show that you can represent a trained neural network in a more simplified way. And those could even be inspiration for how we choose to understand them. Okay, so I just want to summarize. I am claiming that neuroscience and interpretable AI, they both aim to make sense of how neural systems create behavior, and so we should unite them in a way that is hopefully synergistic, I think synergistic, and with the focus should be on testing out tools on artificial neural networks, so that we can rapidly determine if they have this kind of experimentally verified understanding. But it will be hard because we kind of need to develop completely new concepts for these distributed, nonlinear, recurrent, hierarchical systems that it's not intuitive for us to grasp. Okay, so I just wanted to kind of summarize the questions that I've been posing throughout here. Some of what I've been talking about is available on this archive paper, and also thanks to David Bao, who works in interpretable AI, for helping me learn about the state of the field.
Thank you. So for once, I just want to start with questions from the back of the audience. So we have one here.
Hello, thank you so much for your talk. Yeah, I think the main question that I have was, yeah, a lot of these, it seems like there's a lot of these like hand wavy similarities, like, oh, it being high dimensional and it being like non-linear. And I'm curious if these actually translate in practice. I assume that there are or have already been many neuroscience-inspired interpretability-esque things that have been tried on artificial neural networks and historical literature looking into this. And I'm just curious what you found in your literature review and looking at previous attempts, what has failed or succeeded?
So yeah, people, are definitely using methods that I don't know if they are directly inspired by neuroscience, but are common to neuroscience, applied to artificial neural networks. So the reason that I am so focused on this being like a test of the tools, that we want to empirically validate the tools, is because even if you see examples of, this method was applied to this network, if you don't have a unified way of measuring success, you can't really make a claim about how well it worked. And if you don't also show the examples where someone tried to apply that analysis and it failed and they didn't publish it, you can't really say anything about that method. So you can find the examples of somewhat success, like people apply the method to an artificial neural network, they found the results interesting and useful enough to publish a paper on it. But that's not going to give you like the actual empirical sense of how good it was. Yeah, so I think actually the stuff that we saw, so some of the papers that people have been showing, David Bao is a co-author on a lot of them. So for example, like the Othello example and changing the representation of like Seattle and the Space Needle. Like there's an example where you can say the Space Needle is in Paris and show that the network goes on to believe that, like that kind of thing. So I think those examples, they usually involve like some complex nonlinear probe, and then using that probe to change the representation in some way. But those are really good because they build in this, sense of validating your understanding by actually being able to control the model. So those I would think are the most successful. And again, I don't know if these probes are directly influenced by neuroscience, but certainly neuroscientists try to read out information in different brain areas and make claims about how the brain works by doing that. Now, interestingly, neuroscience does usually focus more on linear probes. Essentially because if you do, as has been discussed, if you do enough nonlinear computations, you're simply replicating like the rest of the brain. If there's a way to do a nonlinear analysis on the retina that gives you IT cortex, that gives you object recognition, because that's what the system is. It's a nonlinear system. So neuroscience tends to focus on linear systems, which maybe is restricting their ability to actually control these systems, whereas these nonlinear probes seem to be working better. So maybe neuroscience needs to grapple with that.
Yeah, thank you, Grace. You said that we cannot test experimentally a model But in my mind, as I know from computational neuroscience again, and I'm sorry I bring it all the time, you can have predictions that you can go and look in the brains. You can have predictions like, oh, if you disrupt the neurofeedback, you will have this result, and you can go and do it in the brain. Or if you block the receptors of adaptation, spike frequency adaptation, you can have another effect. Or many examples from biophysically realistic neural network models. So I was wondering what do you think? Shouldn't we focus more into making the AI more biophysically realistic than trying to apply the tools? And why you think, or I suppose maybe you think both are valuable. I was wondering whether you think the other way is more difficult or something. And in the end, you also do all the tools can apply in many systems, physical systems that have nothing to do with the brain. So trying to get a connection after you have the same tools in different systems between the systems, it will maybe create a problem that you have systems like, I don't know, molecules, take AlphaGo. Does this mean that if you apply the tools to them, what you find, it will be like the brain, you do climate science, for example.
Yeah, so the first part about, you can make a prediction and then you can go in and test that prediction. That's like the ideal description of what you can do. In practice, though, the ability to modulate neural activity in a real brain is very difficult. And you can do an approximation of what you would exactly want to do, but then if it comes back that, you weren't able to predict the outcome of your experiment, you could say, oh, well, it's because this method wasn't doing the exact test that I needed it to do. It was, it's too coarse or something like that. And so when you have those unknown factors, you can always appeal to those as an explanation for why you can't understand your system. And so that's why I think you need a system that you can fully observe in order to truly explore these methods. I think your second 2 points are related, because the idea of putting biological details into neural networks, love it, great. I like it for modeling the brain, but for this project, I like it because it would expand the types of systems that you can test these methods on. So you can try like a more vanilla neural network, you can try a neural network that has a bunch of biological constraints, and you can see if a method helps you in one system or the other. Because the thing that neuroscientists sometimes say, if they can get past just the sheer like artificial neural networks aren't the brain, if they can get past that for a second, they seem to have an intuition that the brain is easier to understand than an artificial neural network. And that feels bold. And if that's the case, I would love to know why. I would love to be told the details about the brain that make it easier to understand than an artificial neural network. And then I want to put that in an artificial neural network and see if it's easier to understand. So I think, that goes hand in hand. If there's something about the brain that makes it easier to understand, that would help interpretable AI a lot. We could train real neural networks that we use in the field with that easier interpretability. And then it would also help us study the tools that we use to study the brain.
Oh, hi. Well, thank you. That's quite interesting. And I was very interested in your explanation regarding question 2, about like comparing two systems. And I'm curious about a point that you mentioned towards the beginning, when you could choose different types of ANNs and architectures and then aggregating results from them. I would imagine one challenge that would emerge has to do with choosing the types and architectures of ANNs and also aggregating results among them, because in practice, there will be noise and they might not be the same. So how did you choose the models and how did you aggregate the results?
Yeah, so I think, you would, for any given method, there will be, the method will be designed in some way to be more applicable to certain questions or types of systems than others. So you'd want to pick the models that represent, how the method is normally used in neuroscience if you're pulling from neuroscience. So that's a starting place for deciding the methods. Given those constraints, though, I think you should be as diverse as possible to get like a full sampling, and then you could maybe see some trends in that. That help you understand when that tool is most useful. And in terms of kind of aggregating across networks, in this paper, I have like, it's still pretty hand wavy, but like an approach to that, which is basically like, you can apply the method and, first step is it doesn't even give you interpretable results. Let's say you do PCA on your neural activity and there's not even any pretty lines to look at and talk about, like it's just a big jumbled mess. So that ends there, there's nothing you can get from that. The second stage would be you get a nice interpretable result and it gives you an intuition for how the system works. You feel like you've gained understanding. Then you actually test that understanding. One outcome is, yes, you gained understanding, you can control your network now, great. Or you felt like you understood it, but it actually didn't help you to control the network. And I'll say in my experience in analyzing neural networks, that's the most common path. I feel like I gained something, I try to actually verify it, and it's like, uh-oh, no, that's not how it was working. So I think that kind of way of dissecting, the success of the method is at least a starting point for this. Now, there's a lot of subjectivity because we're basically just doing science. Like you have to come up with a hypothesis and implement a test of it and all of that. But it's at least something.
Hello, thank you, Grace. It was a great talk. I just had a question about maybe, I guess when you started, one of the motivations of the work is to be able to validate the tools that we have in neuroscience itself, right? So we are trying to find out what is the relationship between neuroactivity and behavior. We have all these tools, we don't know. We don't have how to actually validate the model itself because of all the complexities. Then you suggested that we go to the artificial models, to the artificial neural networks, and we use the neuroscience tools. And let's say that you use them, you see they work. I was just wondering, how would you go back to brain and say that it's a good model to brains unless you already accept the relationship between brains and the artificial neural networks is one of similarity? Because at the conclusion, you say like, oh, we can do this without assuming what the relationship is. But then I just don't see how could you go from the artificial to the brain without the relationship. Thank you.
So yes, this is a common concern that the way that they perform on artificial neural networks will not tell you whether or not they're good on brains. I think so. Where I try to address that, where is it? I would say that they share these features is something, because at least from my perspective, and I think most of systems neuroscience, these are like the facts of the brain that you're grappling with. And so if you're studying a system that has all of these, then you can believe that possibly that an analysis method that helps you tame all of this will work if it's artificial or if it's not. The claim that I'm trying to make that they don't need to be similar is a little bit more specific. Like they need to share these features, but you don't have to prove to me that this convolutional neural network is the best predictor of visual neuron activity in the macaque in order for me to want to test a tool on it. Because again, neuroscientists use their tools on systems that they don't believe are that similar at all, and they still accept that as valid. And you still see inspiration, like a method that was developed in larval zebrafish could still be applied to fMRI data, and people wouldn't, throw up their hands and say this isn't going to help us. So I think it's a not perfectly defined level of similarity. It's a vaguer sense of there's something in common here that the analysis methods are trying to get at. But I think it at least doesn't mean that they have to be exactly identical.
Hi, Grace. Thank you for the extremely thought-provoking talk. I guess I have a two sub-part question. So I guess the first one is, in your literature search, was there a interpretable AI method that you really liked and think this provides a level of understanding of artificial neural networks? And then the second part is, if you've came across this notion of mechanistic interpretability, which is like, I guess, championed by Chris Olah and kind of studies ANNs in terms of things like semantic neurons, circuit motifs, and whatnot. What are your thoughts on this way of understanding ANNs?
Yeah, so for the first question, I'm going to go back to what I said before, which is that I think a lot of David Bau's work of actually manipulating representations that change behavior is like, I see that and I'm like, that's what we need for sure. I've also been influenced by kind of earlier methods of interpretability, like visualization of features and all of that. But those, because they're not demonstrating control, there's a lot of, concerns that people have about what does this really mean? What is it showing us? How arbitrary is it? And all of that. And so by demonstrating control, you're just like getting rid of a lot of concerns. And then, so the mechanistic interpretability stuff. Yeah, I think So I might not be like remembering it all perfectly. So maybe ask me later after I check back in with it. But I mean, I love like the work that Chris Ola has been doing. I think maybe compared to what I'm talking about, that's a little bit more kind of prescribed in terms of what explanation you're looking for, like what level you're saying you want the explanation to happen on. And I'm maybe a little bit more open to all different kinds of concepts and ways of understanding as long as they can demonstrate control.
Thank you so much. I absolutely love the talk. First, I wanted to say, in the case of industry AI, many of them are actually built to either imitate, interact with humans, or serve human goals. So in that way, comparative applications of methods quite common, in fact, and that's why a lot of people with these kinds of trainings get hired in industry AI. Some examples include neuro-inspired manifold acrobatics, like similar to the stuff that you're showing, to analyze Xbox human game data and then use that manifold as an objective function to train AI instead of giving it reward for or defining objectives. Another example is building behavioral tests for deep MBRL like Planet, like Dreamer, and showing that, for instance, they don't pass simple model-based behavior that humans pass. So I've seen both successful applications in deep learning, in papers that are the NeurIPS and ICML and everything, that direct inspiration is used and cited from neuroscience and cognitive science. What I did want to ask you is whether you think ANNs could be used as an intermediate step to understand larger neural systems, whether it's human brains or whether it's large language models. Because that algorithmic level of abstraction that you were talking about, we could actually not compare ANNs and humans only, but having validated that ANNs can be used to understand some things about human brains, maybe we can use this as an intermediate to both larger language models and brains that are just much less understandable or malleable than ANNs are. So what do you think of this particular case, which is ANNs as an intermediate for all of these larger neural systems?
So you're saying like kind of a toy ANN model, like you wouldn't study, ChatGPT-3 directly, you would study some smaller.
No, in order to study ChatGPT, we use ANNs the same way we use ANNs to study brains.
In terms of like, I guess people use ANNs a few different ways to study brains. Do you mean like
build a model of the manifold and then try to understand how some process could be happening for some higher level of abstract representations, for instance, as we do in humans, but apply the same thing to larger language models, but using smaller ANNs as an intermediate?
Yeah, it certainly seems like something you could do. I definitely see why that would be an approach. I guess in my like personal experience, trying to use like smaller, less constrained models, in a way they can be harder to like make sense of and relate to things because like if you use a model trained on MNIST, like you can solve MNIST with basically random projections almost, and so the model isn't constrained enough to learn something useful versus like a giant artificial neural network. So if the model you're using to be the stand-in, like the small ANN is too small or not representing the full complexity of the problem, then I just think that it might fall apart there.
Represent the exact level of abstraction you're trying to explain, not just for it to solve the task, but very hypothesis-driven approach that you're just using the NNs, for instance, let's say, to understand the different kinds of personas that emerge out of LLMs or different modes of operation that emerge.
Okay, yeah. So, but then do you view that as kind of understanding, I mean, maybe this isn't a separable thing, but do you view that as understanding the way that the full system works, or do you view that as understanding like the space that the full system learned, if that makes sense?
In case of large language models, we want both, right? So I would say for both it can be used, depending on, but I'm just saying the same way that we are using these models to understand better what's inside human brains with 100 billion neurons, the same way we can use these models as a proxy, and they're not used the same way in all of the experimental approaches in neuroscience.
Yeah.
Yeah, I just wanted to follow up on the earlier question about whether you can say both these things at once. Like one, they don't have to be models of each other in order for the same tools to work, but also that there will be systems that are different enough that you can't apply the same tools to both of them. So it seems like one thing you might say is that the right relationship between systems where you can use the same tools is that they can both be helpfully described at the same level of abstraction. And namely the level of abstraction that's whatever it is that the tool that you're using is sensitive to, right? Like, but it seems like there could easily be cases where there is some kind of structure in one kind of system that isn't there at all in the other structure. So you have a tool that just picks that up. I guess it's not totally clear to me that we shouldn't think that that's true in brains. And I assume that that's what you hear from neuroscientists all the time.
Yeah. So as you can see, I think this talk is inspired by criticism from neuroscientists a bit. So that's why I point to like the fact that neuroscientists do this kind of thing, comparing or using the same tool across different systems without really explicitly saying what's similar in those systems that make it possible. But yeah, I think that's why, you know, this the third discussion question is kind of crucial to actually a little bit to the argument in total, because basically, yeah, like what is the level that we're trying to get at? I think that's open-ended. I think we don't know what exactly we're trying to say about the system, except I would argue that you want to be able to control behavior in a somewhat straightforward way if you have that kind of understanding. So yeah, we need to both define the level that we're trying to study and develop the tools that can study it, and those go hand in hand. And we're a little, I mean, from my perspective, a little adrift in that.
I guess I just want to push a little bit, because it seems like, you know, if there is helpful structure in both systems at the same level of description, then it seems like in that respect, they are models of each other. And like,
oh, okay, yeah. So, but yeah, I would again point to the fact that, like, you know, you could have a study where you have a bunch of humans performing a task, and, you know, you get fMRI or whatever, and you use the same analysis method to say this group of humans does it this way, and that group of humans does it the other way. And then you would say, well, they're not the same, they're different. But it's the same analysis method that tells you that. So some people say, well, artificial neural networks are, you know, processing images according to texture, not shape, and therefore they're poor models. And okay, maybe they're poor models, but I can still use the same analysis method on both of them.
and can you also just put the slide with the AI methods back up?
That box came from David Bao. I want to be explicit about that credit.
We have time for a few more questions.
So I wanted to ask you about a different kind of analysis, the one that Nico Kriegerskorte was laying out yesterday, where the deep neural network is part of the analysis of the brain, so that you train it on the task, say, and then you validate different models by seeing how well they fit brain data. And he showed a nice use of controversial examples to try and pull models apart. That looks like a neural network analysis method. I can't quite see exactly how it fits in your like taxonomy, but I'm interested to know what you think about it as a method.
Yeah. So the basic idea of, you know, training networks on the same task that the brain can do, and looking at the representations and comparing that to representations in the brain, I'm definitely in support of that. That's the basis of a lot of my own work on vision and attention. So that would be an example of trying to make the claim that they are good models, right? Like you train them and they learn the same representations, and so they're good models. And so that, I mean, I support that in its own right on that side. And then this particular method of then now using that to create these controversial stimuli to you know, kind of determine which stimulus best aligns with humans and all of that. Yeah, that's a method of understanding. In that case, you know, the goal is to understand the human brain to see what aligns with humans, but you could apply that to understand networks amongst themselves, like see how similar the controversial examples are, you know, if you have two networks and then you look at a third or something like that. So that would just fall into, I guess, like a tool that could be tested in this way. That one's, you know, it's a little bit tricky because you know, the definition of what you're trying to understand and how that would relate to being able to control the network, I think is maybe a little bit vaguer there, making that connection. So in some ways it would be hard to validate the utility of that method in the way that I'm suggesting, but you know, maybe one could think of a way. So yeah, so that's it would kind of, in my mind, that would slot into one of the methods that could be tested.
No, I didn't.
Sorry. I have time for one more question.
Thank you. Thanks for the talk, Grace. Can you show the last slide about it? I think what was the language of like it was like Q3. What is the language of? Okay, so I wondered maybe taking a question in another approach. What do you think, as someone who as well is in two fields, should be even the publication model for a neural systems approach? Because on one end, you know, in neuroscience, it's like there's no deadline. It's classic journals. You have to pay to publish. And I could even argue it's the culprit for why neuroscience has been moving relatively slow. Me being biased as a neuroscience in training. On the flip side, I don't submit my work to neuroscience because in CS, you know, there's stuff like archive, NeurIPS and CVPR, and they kind of have their deadline and everything is just this moving machine, right? So what things would you think we should change if we want this kind of biological and artificial neural systems type of research community in terms of bringing from both fields together to get like this, I guess, venue or publication model where we get the best of both worlds?
Yeah, so I think, yeah, you know, being at this intersection, I hear people complain from both sides, you know, yeah, like neuroscience, traditionally you submit to journals and it is hard to get people to be motivated to get it out the door. I mean, neuroscience has made progress in terms of, you know, bioarchive being totally acceptable now. You know, I got a professorship job with like 3 preprints that were never published. So clearly something's changing. So I think that is good, you know, just being able to share the work quicker without the conference deadline system. You know, people aren't doing the work quicker, but the flip side of the conference system is that people are super rushed. They're short papers, you know, maybe they're not that well written or, you know, explaining their concepts that well. And also the review process is pretty rushed, I would say, on the ML conference side. So I don't think that just moving in that direction is the solution. There are, you know, at least progress in terms of more open reviewing that also neuroscience and biology are embracing a bit more. So I think being able to see the reviewer back and forth is super great for any field. But yeah, I can't solve the problem that you need people to, you know, get their work out the door. I think that's tricky. But yeah, so like at least in this case, the kind of style of publication I would imagine wouldn't fit well in a machine learning conference because it would be too long. Because I think like the ideal way to fully demonstrate, you know, the ability of a tool from neuroscience would be to first review all the use cases in neuroscience. How do people normally use it? What do they normally say from it? Then, you know, show all these neural networks that, you know, feel relevant for the tool, show the results of testing all of them, and like kind of like summarize. And I think that's just like too broad and long for a machine learning conference kind of situation, but also super non-standard from a neuroscience perspective. So yeah, I didn't really think about it. I figured I would just post this kind of work on a preprint server and have publishing be sorted out later.
The time we have time for, so let's thank Grace one more time.